Okay, so have you ever had that weird feeling like someone is watching you through your webcam?
Oh, yeah, we've all been there.
Right. But imagine that feeling, but times like 1,000. And knowing it's not just some random creep, but like state-sponsored hackers coming after your sources.
That's everyday life for a lot of journalists these days.
That's exactly what we're diving into today. Cybersecurity in journalism.
It's high-stakes stuff, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Protecting information, sensitive information that could make or break careers, even put lives at risk.
No doubt.
So to help us navigate this whole digital minefield, we've got some sources about this fascinating woman, Runa Sandvik, a cybersecurity pro who's worked at the New York Times.
She helped a lot of reporters navigate this really treacherous world.
Yeah. And get this, she's also a pole dancing hobbyist.
Let's come about range, right?
Total opposite ends of the spectrum.
It's that unique perspective that makes her work so fascinating, though. She really gets the technical stuff, but also the human side of it. You know, that fear and vulnerability that journalists face online.
Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, she once hacked a Linux-powered sniper rifle.
Wait, really?
Yeah. But more importantly for our deep dive today, she knows what it feels like to be a target. A Twitter employee, get this, working for the Saudi government, was spying on her.
Wow, so she's been there. She knows what it's like.
Exactly. And that experience really informs her work. So let's jump into one of the sources. It details like a major wake-up call for the journalism world. The Chinese government hacking into the New York Times network back in 2012.
A huge turning point.
Yeah. They were after information on this corruption scandal involved China's former prime minister.
And it wasn't just a little hack either.
No, not at all. We're talking 45 pieces of custom-designed malware, 53 employees being spied on. They even activated microphones and webcams.
Talk about a full-blown digital assault. It went on for months. The Times realized after that they just couldn't guarantee the confidentiality they promised their sources.
I can't imagine what a chilling effect that must have had on investigative reporting. Sources drying up left and right.
Absolutely.
A pivotal moment for sure. It forced news organizations to really confront cybersecurity not just as like an IT problem, but like a core journalistic principle.
Couldn't agree more.
And that's where Runa Sandvik steps onto the scene.
The Times brought her on as head of information security, right? Her mission was to prevent another attack like that from happening again.
Yep. And she was more than qualified for the job. Self-taught hacker involved with the Tor project.
The Tor project, for listeners who might not know, it's that network that helps people stay anonymous online.
Exactly. So she knows how these digital bad guys think.
I was reading how she's almost fearless, but also deeply privacy obsessed.
Well, yeah, to be good at this, you kind of have to be both, right? Like, think like the attacker and the defender at the same time.
Absolutely. And this was also around the time when we saw those incredibly powerful spyware tools come on the scene.
Things like Pegasus, which was developed by the NSO group.
Yeah, Pegasus. I mean, the name sounds more like a mythical creature than a piece of software.
Right.
But in terms of how it operates, it might as well be mythical. This spyware can actually turn your phone into a 24/7 surveillance device.
So it can get your messages, photos, even turn on your camera and microphone without you knowing.
All of that. And it all gets sent back to whoever's using the software.
It's like having this ghost in your pocket, stealing all your information.
Yeah. And one of our sources goes into the experience of Ben Hubbard. He's a New York Times correspondent who was targeted by Pegasus.
He was pretty tech-savvy, right?
Oh, yeah. He got this text message that he knew was suspicious, so he didn't click the link, but it didn't matter. Pegasus is so insidious that it can use vulnerabilities in your phone's software to get in without any user interaction.
So even if you're careful about what you click on, you could still be targeted.
Yeah.
That's terrifying.
It really is. Later, they found out that his phone had been hacked multiple times, and they had accessed all his stuff. Contacts, photos, messages, even potentially bank accounts. What's worse is that the hackers wiped any trace of how they got in.
It's like a ghost story. You know you've been robbed, but there's no sign of the thief.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so difficult to detect and prevent. But we can make it harder. Runa Sandvik is a big believer in that.
So besides just using strong passwords and two-factor authentication, what can journalists do?
Well, one interesting thing that Sandvik did was create a public database to track Pegasus infections. It allowed her to really see how big this problem was and who was being targeted.
So, like, know your enemy.
Exactly. The list grew quickly, hundreds of people on it, many of them journalists and activists, human rights defenders.
So she's not just reacting, she's trying to get ahead of it.
Right. And she's worked with a lot of journalists and organizations to try and reduce the risk, like in the case with El Faro, the newspaper in El Salvador. Their reporters were targeted even though they were using encrypted messaging apps.
So even if you're doing everything right, it might not be enough.
It really highlights that total protection is so difficult, but not impossible. Sandvik says we can always make the attack harder, make ourselves less appealing as targets.
So, it's an arms race. Trying to stay ahead of the bad guys.
That's a good way to put it. As cybersecurity measures get better, attackers develop new ways to get around them.
Makes you wonder about the future of cybersecurity and journalism. Seems like the threats are just going to get more sophisticated, harder to defend against.
It's definitely something to be concerned about, but as more people become aware, we're seeing more investment in new tools for protection.
And there's more collaboration too, right?
Yeah, between security experts, journalists, and organizations like the Committee to Protect Journalists. Sharing information is so important in this fight.
Okay, so let's talk about some emerging trends that journalists really need to know about. Our sources talk about another spyware company called Candiru. And this one sounds even scarier than Pegasus.
Oh, it is. Candiru is very insidious. Their spyware, it's called Devil's Tongue, and it's been found on hundreds of websites, a lot of them disguised as legitimate organizations like Amnesty International or Black Lives Matter.
So they're using fake websites to trick people.
Yeah, it's another type of social engineering, preying on people's trust to compromise their devices, and they've targeted hundreds of people, including journalists, in at least 10 countries.
That's messed up. And it feels like this is becoming more common, too, with governments using spyware to silence their critics and control what people hear.
Absolutely. It's a direct attack on freedom of the press, freedom of expression. And it's not just those authoritarian regimes either.
Oh, really?
Yeah, our sources indicate that even democratic governments are using these tools against journalists and activists.
So it's not just about protecting yourself from hackers. It's about protecting yourself from your own government, too.
That's the scary reality. And it raises so many questions about security and privacy. How do you find a good balance?
It really does feel like David versus Goliath. What can journalists and activists actually do against these massive forces?
Well, Runa Sandvik's story is a good reminder that even small actions can make a difference. Raising awareness, developing security protocols, tracking these infections, it all contributes to a better defense.
And there are organizations that are fighting for these digital rights, too, providing resources and support, like the Committee to Protect Journalists, Citizen Lab, the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Right. We need to work together and hold those in power accountable. We need stronger laws, more transparency around how these surveillance technologies are being used.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the threats, some potential solutions, but something that's really stayed with me is that Runa Sandvik, this cybersecurity expert, was targeted herself by that Twitter employee working for the Saudi government.
It's a big reminder that even those who are super tech savvy can still be vulnerable.
If someone like her can be compromised, what hope is there for the rest of us?
I think it highlights just how hard this fight is. We're always defending, while those using spyware only need to find one weakness to succeed.
So what can the average person, not a journalist, not an activist, do to protect themselves? It's easy to feel powerless in all of this.
Well, it's important to remember that cybersecurity isn't just an issue for tech people or high-profile individuals anymore. It affects us all, and we all need to be taking steps to protect ourselves.
So it's not about being paranoid. It's about being smart and taking precautions.
Right. Understanding the risks, making informed choices about the tools we use, and really pushing for stronger privacy protections.
Before we wrap up this first part, I wanted to touch on something we mentioned before, Runa Sandvik's. Her love of pole dancing seems like a pretty unexpected hobby for someone in her field.
It really is an interesting contrast. This world of cybersecurity, it's usually seen as cold and technical, but then you have this thing that's so physical and expressive.
Definitely not what you'd expect from a cybersecurity expert.
And maybe that's part of what makes her so good at it, Her wide range of interests suggests a mind that's always looking for new things and challenging those old ways of thinking.
I love that. It's like, even when you're up against these crazy challenges, find those things that bring you joy and make you think.
To the resilience of the human spirit.
Well said. I think that's a good place to pause for now. We've covered a lot of ground already. In part 2, we're going to dig even deeper into these challenges and solutions that journalists are facing in this constantly changing digital landscape. Stay tuned.
Can't wait. Welcome back to our deep dive into cybersecurity and journalism. Last time we were talking about state-sponsored espionage and things like Pegasus spyware.
Yeah, it kind of makes you want to, like, ditch your phone and move off the grid.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
But before we all get too paranoid, let's dig a little deeper into the challenges journalists face and what they can actually do to protect themselves. Remember Ben Hubbard, the New York Times correspondent?
Yeah, the one who was targeted by Pegasus. Didn't he seem pretty careful, though?
He was. One of our sources talks about how he got this suspicious text message inviting him to a protest at the Saudi embassy in Washington, D.C. He knew it was fishy, so he didn't click the link, but...
But that's how you get infected, right? Clicking on bad links.
Well, it used to be, but Pegasus is way more advanced than that. It can actually use security holes in your phone's software to get in without you doing anything. Zero-click technology, they call it.
So even if you're super careful, you're not safe. That's scary.
It is, and that's exactly what happened to Ben Hubbard. They found out later that his phone had been hacked over and over again, and they took everything. Contacts, photos, messages, maybe even bank info. And then, get this, the hackers covered their tracks completely, like they were never even there.
It's creepy. Like a digital ghost story. You know you've been robbed, but there's no sign of a break-in.
Exactly. And that's what makes these attacks so hard to stop. But as we were talking about before, Runa Sandic really believes that we can make things harder for them.
Okay, so what else can journalists do besides the basics, like strong passwords and two-factor?
Well, one thing Sandvik did was actually create a public database to keep track of all the Pegasus infections. That way, she could get a handle on how widespread the problem was and who was being targeted.
It's like that saying, know your enemy.
Yeah, exactly. And the list just kept growing. Hundreds of people on it, a lot of journalists, activists, people fighting for human rights.
So she's not just sitting back, she's trying to get ahead of it.
Right. And she's worked directly with journalists and organizations to try and minimize the risks, like with El Faro, that newspaper in El Salvador.
The one where the reporters were targeted, even though they were using those encrypted messaging apps, right?
Right. It just goes to show that total protection is really, really hard to achieve, but it's not impossible. Sandvik says we can always raise the bar, make it more difficult and less appealing to attack us.
So it's this constant arms race,
Yeah.
trying to stay one step ahead of the bad guys.
That's a great analogy. As cybersecurity gets better, the attackers just come up with new ways to get around it.
It makes you wonder what the future holds for journalism. I mean, are these threats just going to keep getting worse and worse?
That's a valid concern, but, as more people become aware, we're seeing more and more investment in new security tools.
And more people working together, too, right?
Absolutely. Security experts, journalists, groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, they're all sharing information, which is crucial.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the newer threats that journalists need to be aware of. Our sources mentioned this other spyware company called Candiru, and it sounds even worse than Pegasus.
Oh, it is. Candiru is really sneaky. Their spyware, it's called Devil's Tongue, and they've actually planted it on hundreds of websites. Lots of them are made to look like legitimate organizations, like Amnesty International or Black Lives Matter.
So they're setting traps, basically, using fake websites.
Exactly. It's all about tricking people into trusting them, then using that trust to get into their devices. They've already gone after hundreds of people, a lot of them journalists, in something like 10 countries.
That's messed up.
Yeah.
And it feels like it's only getting more common. Governments using this spyware to shut down critics and control the information people see.
Yeah, it's a direct attack on freedom of the press, freedom of speech. And it's not just happening in those authoritarian regimes either.
No way.
Seriously.
Yeah. We found sources that show that even democratic governments are using this stuff against journalists and activists.
So you're not just protecting yourself from hackers, you're protecting yourself from your own government too.
That's the reality, unfortunately. And it really raises some ethical and legal questions. Where do you draw the line between security and privacy?
That's a tough one. It feels like such a huge, uneven fight. I mean, what can journalists and activists really do against these governments?
Well, think back to Runa Sandic. Her story shows that even little things can make a big difference. Speaking out, putting security measures in place, keeping track of these infections, it all adds up. And there are groups out there who are fighting for these digital rights, right? Providing support, like the Committee to Protect Journalists, Citizen Lab, the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Exactly. We need to work together on this, hold those in power accountable. Stronger laws, more transparency about how these technologies are being used. That's what we need.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges, the threats, some potential solutions, but It's kind of crazy to think that Runa Sandvik, this cybersecurity expert, was actually targeted herself by that Twitter employee working for the Saudi government.
It really goes to show that no one is immune to this stuff. Even the most tech-savvy people can be vulnerable.
I mean, if someone like her can be targeted, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Well, I think it just highlights the uphill battle we're facing. We're always on defense, and they only need to find one crack in our armor to get in.
So for regular people who aren't journalists or activists, what can they do to protect themselves? It's easy to feel kind of helpless in all of this.
It's important to remember that cybersecurity isn't just for the experts anymore. It affects all of us, and we all need to be taking steps to be safe online.
So it's not about being paranoid, it's about being proactive.
Exactly. Understanding the risks, making smart choices about the tech we use, and, really pushing for better privacy protections.
Before we wrap up part 2, I wanted to circle back to something we mentioned earlier, Runa Sandvik's, her love of pole dancing. It's not really what you'd expect from someone in her field, right?
Yeah, it's such an interesting contrast. You've got this world of cybersecurity, which is often seen as very serious and technical, and then you've got something like pole dancing, which is so physical and expressive.
Totally different worlds.
Maybe that's part of what makes her so good at what she does, though. Having those different interests, it keeps your mind open and challenges you to think in new ways.
I like that. It's like even when you're facing these huge, scary challenges, don't forget to find the things that bring you joy and keep you curious.
To the resilience of the human spirit.
Love it. Well, I think this is a good place to stop for now. We've gone over a lot of ground in part 2, and in part 3, we'll explore even more insights and practical tips for staying safe in this crazy digital world. We'll see you soon. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into cybersecurity and journalism. We've talked about how sophisticated spyware has become, the constant struggle to protect information, and even the psychological impact these attacks can have.
It's been a pretty intense journey, that's for sure, exploring this digital landscape that just seems to keep getting more complex and, honestly, kind of scary.
Yeah, unsettling for sure. But it's not all doom and gloom, right? I mean, Runa Sandvik's story has really stuck with me. Even after being targeted herself, she's still so optimistic. She believes we can actually fight back.
Her resilience is definitely something else, and her work shows us that even small steps can make a difference. But before we wrap up, I think we should talk more about the lasting impact of these attacks, the psychological effects.
Yeah, because it's not just about the information that's taken, right? It's that violation of privacy, the constant fear that someone's watching you. That has to take a toll.
Absolutely. We were talking before about how Sandvik was targeted by that Twitter employee who was working for the Saudi government. They were spying on her account, and to this day, she still doesn't know what they got or for how long.
That's got to mess with your head. It's like a shadow following you around, never knowing what they know or what they might do with it.
It really shows how important it is to have psychological support to build up resilience, especially for journalists. Imagine trying to do your job knowing that every conversation, even personal ones, could be compromised.
That's not paranoia. That's a real threat. And it can seriously impact their ability to report effectively.
No doubt about it. That's why groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists are so important. They offer counseling, legal help, and other support for journalists who've been targeted. They get that cybersecurity isn't just a tech problem. It has a real human cost.
It's about taking care of people, helping them recover, and making sure they can keep doing their jobs without being afraid.
Right. So, looking ahead, what do you think the future holds for cybersecurity and journalism? What trends should we be watching out for?
One of the things we read was actually a prediction from Sandvik herself. She thinks we're going to see even more powerful spyware in the future. Spyware that can get into your system, steal everything, and then disappear without a trace.
Yikes. That's not exactly comforting. But I guess given how fast technology is moving, it's not that far-fetched either.
It feels like we're always trying to catch up, always one step behind. How are journalists and news organizations supposed to deal with that?
Well, I think the key is to stay informed, be adaptable, and build strong connections. Informed about the latest threats, adaptable to new technologies and attacks, and connected to a network of experts and resources.
So it's about creating this whole culture of cybersecurity, not just within newsrooms, but for individual journalists, too.
Right. And that means investing in the right training, the right tools, the right tech to help minimize those risks. It's not a one-time fix. It's a constant process.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've gone through a lot of technical stuff, but What really resonated with me was the human side of all this.
Yeah, I agree. It's easy to get bogged down in the details, but at the end of the day, it's about protecting people.
And Runa Sandik's story really brings that home. She's not just some tech whiz. She's someone who's been through this firsthand. And she reminds us that even when things seem impossible, we can still make a difference.
She's got this unique personality, too, that mix of technical skills, that adventurous spirit, and yeah, even her pole dancing. It shows that you don't have to fit into any one box to make an impact.
I love that. In a world that feels so unpredictable and confusing, I think that's such an important message. Stay curious, stay engaged, and don't be afraid to pursue your passions, even the unexpected ones.
That's beautifully put. It's all about resilience, both as individuals and as a community, so we can keep fighting for a safer, more secure world online.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into cybersecurity and journalism. We hope you found it informative, maybe even a little inspiring.
Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand these threats and how to protect ourselves, the better equipped we'll be to create a safer digital future.
So stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay safe out there. And if you want to learn more, be sure to check out all the resources we've got linked in our show notes.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep fighting the good fight.